The cards hit the wooden table with the sharp crack of destiny being written. 5 men sat in the smoky back room of Murphy's Saloon in Silver Creek, Arizona Territory, 1885. The pot held $300, more money than most saw in a year. But Kestrel wasn't looking at the money anymore. He was looking at the cruel smile spreading across Dutch Morrison's weathered face. "I fold," Kestrel said quietly, his black eyes never leaving Dutch's pale blue ones. The other men groaned, but Dutch's grin only widened. The big rancher had been baiting the Apache scout all evening, making increasingly vicious comments about half-breeds and savage blood. Now he leaned back in his chair, victory written across his sunburned features. "Smart move, Injun," Dutch drawled, raking in the chips. "Though I'm surprised you know when you're beaten. Your kind usually fights to the bitter end, even when it's hopeless." He paused, savoring his next words like expensive whiskey. "Speaking of hopeless, I heard that fat widow, Martha Henderson, is looking for a husband again. Poor woman's been through 3 already. Maybe you should try your luck there, Scout. Might be the only white woman desperate enough." The room went dead silent. Even the piano music from the main saloon seemed to fade. Kestrel's hand didn't move toward his knife, didn't clench into a fist. Instead, he smiled, an expression more dangerous than any weapon. "You seem mighty interested in Mrs. Henderson's affairs, Dutch. Makes a man wonder why." Kestrel's voice carried the soft menace of a rattlesnake's warning. "Tell you what, I'll make you a wager that's got nothing to do with cards." Dutch's eyes narrowed. The other men, old Thompson, young Billy Curtis, and the Mexican vaquero called Santos, leaned forward despite themselves. "I'm listening," Dutch said. "I'll court Martha Henderson, properly, respectfully, like a lady deserves. If I can win her hand in marriage within a month, you pay me that $300 you just won, plus another $200 on top. You also stand up in church and apologize to every person in this town you've insulted with your ignorant mouth." Kestrel's smile never wavered. "But if I fail, I'll leave Silver Creek forever. My word as an Apache." Dutch's laughter boomed through the room. "Court that cow? Boy, you're crazier than I thought. She's fat as a prize heifer, and twice as stubborn. Hell yes, I'll take that bet. This ought to be entertaining as a circus." The handshakes were firm. The witnesses nodded. And somewhere across town, Martha Henderson sat alone in her small house, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. Martha stood at her kitchen window the next morning, watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains gold and purple. At 32, she'd buried 3 husbands and learned that most men saw her as either a curse or a convenience. The first had married her for her father's land, the second for her cooking. The third, God rest his soul, had actually loved her, for all of 6 months before consumption took him. She wasn't beautiful by the standards of dime novels. Her body was generous, curved in ways that made other women whisper, and men either stare or look away in embarrassment. Her auburn hair was practical rather than fashionable, usually pinned up to keep it from her work. But her green eyes held intelligence and kindness, and her hands could gentle a spooked horse or comfort a crying child with equal skill. The knock at her door came as she was finishing her morning coffee. She opened it to find a tall man with bronze skin, black hair touched with premature silver, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from surviving in a hard world. She knew him by reputation. Kestrel, the Apache scout who worked for the army and sometimes the sheriff. He was perhaps 40, with scars that spoke of battles and losses, and eyes that seemed to see everything. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, removing his hat. "I wonder if I might speak with you." His voice held traces of his Apache upbringing, but his English was careful and precise. Martha had heard he'd been educated at one of those Indian schools back east. though he'd somehow managed to keep his soul intact through the experience. "Of course. Would you like some coffee?" "That would be kind. Thank you." They sat at her small kitchen table, the morning light streaming between them. Kestrel looked around the neat house, clean curtains, fresh bread cooling on the counter, wildflowers in a mason jar. Everything spoke of a woman who made beauty from simple things. "Mrs. Henderson, I'll speak plainly. I've been alone a long time. My work keeps me traveling, but I'm tired of having no place to call home, no one to share the good days or the bad ones with." He met her eyes directly. "I'd like permission to court you, if you're willing." Martha nearly choked on her coffee. In all her 32 years, no man had asked her permission for anything. They'd asked her father, her brothers, even her neighbors. Never her. "May I ask why?" The question came out more sharply than she intended, but she'd learned to be suspicious of sudden interest from men. Kestrel considered this seriously. "You have a reputation for kindness and intelligence. Your garden is the best in town, and I've heard you took in Mrs. Patterson's children when she was sick with fever. That tells me about your character." He paused. "Also, I've watched you at church. You don't look at me like I'm something wild that might bite. That's rarer than you might think." Martha felt heat creep up her neck. She wasn't used to such directness, such honesty. Most men who'd showed interest had talked around their real reasons, dancing with half-truths and pretty lies. "People will talk," she warned. "An Apache man courting a white widow? In this town? Let them talk. I've heard worse." Martha studied his face, looking for deception or cruelty, or the kind of desperation that made men do foolish things. She found none of it. What she saw was loneliness that matched her own, and a quiet strength that made her feel safer than she had in years. "All right," she said quietly. "You may court me, but proper-like. No rushing, no assumptions." "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." As he left, Martha watched him walk down her garden path with the fluid grace of a man equally comfortable in town or wilderness. She had no idea that across town, Dutch Morrison was already planning how to spend his winnings. The courting that followed was unlike anything Silver Creek had seen. Kestrel appeared every Tuesday and Friday evening, always clean and respectful, often carrying small gifts, not store-bought trinkets, but things he'd made or found. A smooth stone shaped like a heart from the creek, a small wooden box he'd carved with intricate patterns, wild herbs for her garden that he knew would grow well in the desert soil. They walked together in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood, divided between two worlds, the Apache band where he'd been born, and the white schools where he'd learned to read and write. She told him about her dreams of traveling, of seeing the ocean she'd only read about in books. "Why do you scout for the army?" she asked one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the stars emerge. "Your own people are still fighting them in some places." Kestrel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice carried old pain. "Because the fighting has to stop sometime. Too many good people dying on both sides. I speak both languages, know both ways of thinking. Maybe I can help build bridges instead of burning them." He looked at her. "Some folks say that makes me a traitor. Others say it makes me useful. I think it just makes me tired sometimes." Martha reached over and touched his hand, the first time she'd initiated contact between them. His skin was warm and calloused from years of hard work. "I think it makes you brave," she said simply. The town watched their courtship with fascination and growing acceptance. Even the most prejudiced citizens had to admit that Kestrel treated Martha with a respect and gentleness they rarely saw from white men toward their own wives. He helped her with heavy work around her property, fixed her broken fence, and never once spoke to her with anything less than courtesy. But Dutch Morrison was getting nervous. As the month drew toward its end, it became clear that Martha Henderson was falling in love. She smiled more, laughed easily, and had started wearing her good dress even on ordinary days. The weight she carried seemed lighter somehow, not because she'd lost any physical pounds, but because someone was helping her carry life's burdens. "She's actually going to marry him," Dutch muttered to his foreman as they watched Kestrel help Martha load supplies into her wagon outside the general store. "That scout's got her fooled, but she'll figure out what he's really after soon enough." What Dutch didn't understand, what none of the betting men understood, was that somewhere in the midst of pretending to court Martha Henderson, Kestrel had stopped pretending. The woman who offered him coffee and conversation, who laughed at his dry humor and listened to his stories without judgment, had awakened something in him he'd thought was dead. Maybe he'd started this for the wrong reasons, but somewhere along the way, those reasons had changed completely. The proposal came on a Tuesday evening, 3.5 weeks into their courtship. They were sitting by the creek that gave the town its name, watching the sunset paint the water golden red. Martha had brought a picnic supper, and they'd eaten in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds beginning. "Martha," Kestrel said finally, "I have something to ask you." She turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the last light of day. In that moment, she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or convention. Beautiful because she was happy, because she felt valued and cherished for the first time in her adult life. "I love you," he said simply. "Not because you're convenient or available or desperate, but because you're kind and intelligent and stronger than you know. Because you see people for who they are, not what they look like or where they come from. Because you make me want to be better than I am." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring set with a small turquoise stone. "Will you marry me?" Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, neither of them noticed Dutch Morrison watching from the trees, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been shame. The wedding was set for Saturday evening, just 4 days later. Martha had no family left to speak of, and Kestrel's Apache relatives were too far away and wouldn't be welcome in a white town anyway. But the whole community seemed to have adopted the couple. Mrs. Patterson offered her wedding dress, altered to fit. The baker insisted on providing a cake. Even the gruff sheriff, who'd worked with Kestrel for years, offered to walk Martha down the aisle. Friday night, Martha sat in her kitchen, making final preparations for the wedding and the move to Kestrel's small cabin outside town. She was actually humming, when the knock came at her door. She opened it to find Dutch Morrison, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically humble. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "might I have a word?" Against her better judgment, she let him in. Dutch stood awkwardly in her neat kitchen, his massive frame making the space seem smaller. "I owe you an apology," he began, and Martha blinked in surprise. "I've said some unkind things about you, and they weren't true or fair. You're a good woman, and you deserve better treatment." "Thank you," Martha said cautiously. "That's unexpected." Dutch shifted uncomfortably. "There's something else. Something you need to know before you marry that scout." He looked directly at her, his pale eyes unusually serious. "He didn't start courting you because he loves you, Martha. He did it because of a bet. A stupid, cruel bet that I made with him." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, her face going pale. "What kind of bet?" she whispered. Dutch told her everything. The poker game, the insults, the wager. $500 and a public apology if Kestrel could win her hand in marriage within a month. As he spoke, Martha felt something dying inside her chest. Not her heart exactly, but her faith in her own judgment, her hope that someone might actually love her for herself. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked when he finished. Dutch looked genuinely uncomfortable. Because watching you these past weeks, seeing how happy you've been, I realized what a bastard I've been. You don't deserve to be made a fool of, even if the fool-making was my idea to start with. After he left, Martha sat alone in her kitchen as the shadows lengthened. The wedding dress hung on the back of the bedroom door, white and hopeful. The simple meal she'd prepared for tomorrow's celebration sat cooling on the stove. And on her finger, the turquoise ring caught the lamplight like a tiny piece of captured sky. She thought about the past month. Kestrel's careful courtesy in those first meetings. His growing warmth as they'd spent time together. The way he looked at her, like she was precious, valuable, worth cherishing. Had it all been an act? Was she really so foolish, so desperate for love, that she'd been completely taken in by a man playing a part for money? But even as the doubts crept in, other memories surfaced. The way Kestrel's voice had changed when he told her about his childhood, becoming softer and more vulnerable. The careful way he'd helped her grandmother's china when he'd carried it to a high shelf. The night he'd held her while she cried about her third husband, offering comfort with no expectation of anything in return. Those moments didn't feel like acting. They felt real, honest, true. Martha sat up straighter, wiping her eyes. Dutch Morrison had started this mess with his cruelty and his bet. But whatever Kestrel's original motives, the man who'd proposed to her by the creek had been speaking from the heart. She was sure of it. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Saturday evening came with a spectacular desert sunset, the sky blazing orange and purple above the small church. The whole town had turned out, filling the wooden pews with their Sunday best and curious faces. Kestrel stood at the altar in a borrowed black suit, his silver-touched hair neatly combed, looking nervous in a way that had nothing to do with stage fright and everything to do with the depth of his feelings for the woman he was about to marry. Martha was late. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Whispers began among the congregation. The preacher checked his pocket watch. Kestrel's face remained calm, but his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Finally, the church doors opened. Martha walked in alone. No one to give her away. No bridesmaids. Just a woman in a simple white dress, making the most important walk of her life. But she wasn't walking toward the altar. Instead, she moved to face the congregation. "Before we begin," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "there's something everyone needs to know, especially the man I'm about to marry." Kestrel's face went very still. In the third pew, Dutch Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "A month ago," Martha continued, "my husband-to-be made a wager. $500 and a public apology to be won if he could convince me to marry him within 30 days. The congregation gasped and murmured, but Martha held up her hand for silence. The bet was made by Dutch Morrison, who thought it would be entertaining to watch an Apache man try to court a fat white widow. Dutch assumed I was so desperate for a husband that I'd fall for any man who paid me attention." Dutch Morrison had gone pale as old bone. Several people turned to stare at him with disgust. "The thing is," Martha said, turning to look directly at Kestrel, "I found out about the bet yesterday. Dutch told me himself, thinking he was doing me a favor." She paused, letting her words sink in. "So now I have a choice. I can walk away from this altar, humiliated and angry. Or I can marry a man who may have started courting me for the wrong reasons, but who I believe fell in love with me for the right ones." She walked toward Kestrel, her eyes never leaving his face. When she reached him, she saw what she'd hoped to see. Not guilt or shame, but relief and love, and a gratitude so profound it made her own eyes blur with tears. "The bet's off, Dutch," she said without turning around. "Win or lose, my husband doesn't want your money. What he wants is something you can't understand, a partnership built on respect and love, not profit and entertainment." She took Kestrel's hands in hers. "That is what you want, isn't it? More than anything in this world," he said quietly. "Martha, I know," she said gently. "You'll tell me the whole truth later, when we're alone. But right now, I just want you to answer one question honestly, in front of all these people. Anything. Do you love me? Not because I'm convenient or available, not because of any bet or dare, but because of who I am." Kestrel's answer came without hesitation, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. "I love you because you're brave enough to trust when you have every reason not to. Because you make beautiful things grow in desert soil. Because you see the best in people even when they don't deserve it. Because you're standing here right now, knowing the truth about how this started and choosing love anyway." His hands tightened on hers. "I love you, Martha Henderson, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving it if you'll let me." Martha smiled then, radiant and sure. "Then let's get married." The ceremony that followed was simple and beautiful. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was gentle and full of promise. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, all except Dutch Morrison, who slipped out the back door sometime during the vows. At the small reception afterward, old Thompson approached the newlyweds with a grin. "So, what happens to the bet money?" he asked. Kestrel and Martha exchanged glances. "We talked about that," Martha said. "We're using it to start a fund for the school. Every child in this town deserves to learn to read and write, regardless of what they look like or where their families come from." As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Martha found herself standing beside her new husband in the doorway of the church, looking out at the star-filled sky. Tomorrow they would start their married life in Kestrel's small cabin. Tonight, they would spend their first night together as husband and wife. "Are you nervous?" Kestrel asked quietly. Martha considered the question seriously. She was 32 years old, had been married 3 times before, and had just publicly forgiven the man she loved for starting their relationship based on a cruel wager. By all rights, she should be terrified, angry, or at least uncertain. Instead, she felt peaceful. "No," she said finally. "I'm not nervous. I'm ready." The small cabin sat in a grove of cottonwoods about 2 miles outside town, near enough to hear the church bells on Sunday morning, but far enough for privacy. Kestrel had built it himself, solid and simple, with a stone fireplace and windows that caught the morning light. It was clean and neat, but obviously the home of a man who spent much of his time away on scouting missions. Martha walked through the 3 rooms slowly, taking inventory. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf, filled with a surprising collection of volumes. Everything from army manuals to poetry, novels to books on farming and animal husbandry. The kitchen was basic but functional. The bedroom contained a large bed, a dresser, and little else. "It's not much," Kestrel said, watching her anxiously. "We can add on when we need to. Make it more comfortable for you." Martha turned to face him, still wearing her white wedding dress, but with her hair coming loose from its careful arrangement. In the lamplight, she looked softer, more approachable, but also somehow stronger than she had during the ceremony. "It's perfect," she said simply. "It feels like home already." Kestrel moved closer, reaching up to touch her face gently. "Martha, about the bet. Tell me," she said. "All of it. I want to understand." So he did. He told her about Dutch's insults, about his own wounded pride and desire for revenge. He told her about the moment he'd realized his feelings had changed, when acting had become reality and pretense had become truth. "I was going to tell you," he said. "After the wedding, when we were alone. I couldn't let you find out from someone else, and I couldn't start our marriage with lies between us." Martha nodded slowly. I believe you, but I have a confession too. She took his hands in hers. I knew something wasn't quite right from the beginning. You were too perfect, too careful. Men don't usually court women like me with that kind of patience. I thought maybe you had debts or legal troubles or something you needed a wife to help you solve. Kestrel blinked in surprise. You knew? I suspected. But then you started telling me about your childhood, your work, your dreams, and you looked at me like... She paused, searching for words. Like I was worth looking at, worth listening to, worth cherishing. Whatever brought you to my door, that wasn't pretense. They stood together in the lamplight, two people who had found each other through deception, but chosen each other through truth. Outside, night sounds drifted through the windows, owls calling, wind in the cottonwoods, the distant howl of a coyote. What happens now? Kestrel asked. Martha smiled, beginning to unpin her hair. Now we start our marriage. Our real marriage, built on what we actually feel for each other instead of bets or loneliness or desperation. Her auburn hair tumbled down around her shoulders, catching the light like silk. Now we see if two people who've been alone too long can learn to be together. What happened next was private between husband and wife, but gentle and full of wonder. Two people who had known rejection and loneliness learned that love could indeed bloom from the most unlikely soil. They discovered that bodies didn't have to be perfect to give and receive pleasure, that vulnerability could be a gift rather than a weakness, and that the greatest intimacy came not from passion but from acceptance. Martha Henderson had spent her adult life being judged for her size, her circumstances, her choices. In Kestrel's arms, she was simply beloved. Kestrel had spent years moving between worlds, never fully belonging to either one. With Martha, he was home. 5 years later, Martha stood in that same kitchen, now expanded to accommodate a growing family. 2 children played at her feet. Sarah, 4 years old with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes, and baby Joseph, barely walking but already showing signs of his father's quiet intensity. Kestrel came through the door as the sun was setting, dusty from a week-long scouting mission. But this time, he wouldn't be leaving again for months. The Apache wars were finally ending, and his services as a translator and negotiator were no longer needed as frequently. "How was town?" he asked, kissing Martha hello and scooping up Sarah for a hug. "Interesting," Martha said with a smile. "Dutch Morrison is getting married." Kestrel raised an eyebrow. "Anyone I know?" "The new school teacher, Miss Patricia Wells from back east. She's—" Martha paused diplomatically. "She's quite thin, and very proper. I think she's going to reform him completely." They both laughed, remembering the man who had inadvertently brought them together through his cruelty and ignorance. Dutch had indeed made his public apology, standing red-faced before the congregation 5 years ago and admitting his behavior had been wrong. He'd gradually become a better man, though Martha suspected that had more to do with genuine remorse than any influence from her or Kestrel. "Speaking of town," Martha continued, "Mrs. Patterson asked if you'd consider taking over as sheriff when Sheriff Williams retires next year. The pay's steady, and you'd be home every night." Kestrel considered this, bouncing Sarah on his knee. The idea of a settled life, of being a pillar of the community rather than a man always between worlds, appealed to him more than he'd expected. "What do you think?" he asked Martha. "I think this town could use a sheriff who understands justice and mercy in equal measure. I think you'd be good at it." She paused. "And I think our children deserve to grow up seeing their father respected for who he is, not just tolerated for what he can do." That night, after the children were asleep, Martha and Kestrel sat on their expanded porch, watching the stars and talking about the future. The woman who had once been called fat and desperate was now the respected wife of a future sheriff, mother to beautiful children, and cornerstone of a small community. The man who had started their relationship as part of a cruel bet was now devoted husband and father, his mixed heritage seen as an asset rather than a burden. "Do you ever regret it?" Martha asked quietly. "Starting us the way you did?" Kestrel was quiet for a long moment. "I regret the hurt it could have caused you. I regret that someone else had to tell you instead of me. But regret falling in love with you. Regret this life we've built." He reached for her hand, the same one that still wore the simple silver ring with its turquoise stone. "Never, not for a single moment." Martha squeezed his fingers. "Good, because I have something to tell you." She placed his hand on her gently rounded belly, and his eyes widened with wonder and joy. "Again?" he whispered. "Again," she confirmed, laughing at his expression. "I hope you're ready for a house full of children, Sheriff Henderson." "Henderson?" he asked with a grin. "Well, you'll need a respectable American name for the job, and I like the sound of it. The Henderson family of Silver Creek, Arizona." As they sat together under the desert stars, surrounded by the life they had built from the ashes of a cruel bet, both Martha and Kestrel knew they had found something precious and rare. Love that had survived deception to become truth. Partnership that had grown from loneliness into strength. A future that stretched ahead of them, full of promise and possibility. The bet that had started it all was long forgotten by everyone except them, and they remembered it only as the strange path that had led them to each other. Sometimes, Martha reflected, the most beautiful destinations were reached by the most unlikely roads. In Silver Creek, Arizona, people still talked about the Apache scout who had married the widow Henderson. But now they spoke of it as a love story, the kind that proved the human heart could triumph over prejudice and fear. Children heard the tale and grew up believing that love was possible for everyone, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. And in a small cabin surrounded by cottonwoods, two people who had found each other through a cruel joke continued to prove, day after day, that the greatest victories were won not through force or cleverness, but through the simple courage to love and be loved in return. The desert wind carries many stories across the vast American West, but few as enduring as this tale of unexpected love. If you enjoyed this story of second chances and true acceptance, you'll love our next tale of a gunslinger who discovers that the fastest draw sometimes comes from the heart.